Rumble.
Welcome back, everyone, to Rumble Retrospective. I'm your host. My name is Greg. I hope you're all doing well. So, one thing I wanted to do with this series, alongside our monthly documenting of the Royal Rumble events, was to feature some conversations with different people both inside and outside of the business of pro wrestling, and explore different facets and impacts of this medium that we love. Last week, we had a look at the debut Royal Rumble in 1988, the only Rumble to ever take place in Canada, a country which I proudly call home. Canada has a truly rich history in pro wrestling, and this seemed like a great opportunity to discuss that a little bit. I reached out to veteran wrestler Mr. Beefy Goodness Vance Nevada. He's exceptionally charismatic in the ring, but outside of the ring, Vance has also been a mentor to countless workers across Canada, sharing his knowledge and wisdom. In addition to that, Vance is a storied Canadian wrestling historian with 2 published books under his belt so far. His work even led to him receiving the James C. Melby Historian Award by the Cauliflower Alley Club. So let's dive in and find out a few things about wrestling in the Great White North. All right, welcome back, everybody, and I am joined now by Canadian wrestling, I dare say, icon, as well as wrestling historian, Mr. Beefy Goodness, Vance Nevada. How are you doing today, Vance?
Thank you, sir. It's very my pleasure to be here.
And first off, congratulations on your recent retirement.
The final match was in Prince George for Primetime Wrestling in January. You know, while my spine feels great, not getting body slammed every weekend or getting hit with chairs, I'm still adjusting to this idea that I don't have to be somewhere on the weekend. Because, you know, even in the last few years, I was still doing 73 dates a year. So pretty well every weekend I was on the road somewhere between Vancouver and Montreal. So, this is a bit of an adjustment to be home and now start to dig in on, what do I think the next project is? And I'm not sure yet.
Excellent. Well, this is enough to talk about the end of, but let's wind it back. Do you want to tell people about yourself and your career?
Sure. Well, you know, I began wrestling, pretty much right out of high school. So I started wrestling my first match in May 1993, about a month before I graduated high school at 17 years old, and in Winnipeg. And for the first 8 years of my career, 8 or 9 years, I was based out of Winnipeg. And then in 2001, I had my first opportunity to go to the East Coast. At that time for a legendary promoter, Emile Dupree, Grand Prix Wrestling. And that was enough of a taste where I realized I didn't want to be a 40-miler and just stay around Winnipeg. I wanted to get out there to as many territories as possible. So I returned to the Maritimes in 2002. And then immediately when I wrapped up on the East Coast, I moved to the West Coast, which is around the time you and I met each other, working for ECCW and gorgeous Michelle Starr. So it's been a really fascinating journey, getting a chance to see the country from coast to coast and going to communities that if it wasn't for wrestling, I'd have no godly reason to be in those places, including over the frozen ice roads of northern Manitoba for 4 tours with Tony Condello, even further north into the Northwest Territories with Can-Am Wrestling. So it's been a really interesting journey, 33 years. Over 1,800 matches, and some incredible friendships and memories that are probably the greatest part of it all.
Absolutely. Now, along that way, you started becoming a historian and a chronicler of Canadian wrestling history. At what point did that sort of kick in for you?
It sort of happened, by fluke very early on. And I say this frequently, and I mean it. If I had realized how much work it was going to be, and how much of an obsession it was going to become over the last 30 years, I probably never would have started. But it all began, when I was 19, and at that time we had televised like a cable access show for our wrestling program in Winnipeg through Shaw Cable. And I didn't see the show because I lived 2 hours away in another city. So I would go and do the TV taping, and then I'd never get to see the actual product. And then one time I was, staying over in Winnipeg because we had a couple of matches in a row. And I was at one of my buddies' places, and they played the TV. They said, "Hey, do you want to see the show?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I've never actually seen the produced product." So I was watching the matches, and the commentators were talking about my trainer, who was a guy named Ernest Frenchy Rowe from Somerset, Manitoba. And at the time he trained me, he was 63 years old. Just this tough old French pipeline worker who had wrestled in the 70s. And when on the commentary, they talked about, yeah, Vance Nevada is a protege of Ernest Rowe, and Ernest was a former tag team champion with Frenchie Champagne in the old Madison Club in Winnipeg in the 1950s. And this wasn't anything that I'd ever heard before. So at that point, I had just moved to Winnipeg, a young single guy, lots of time on my hands. And I went to the Winnipeg archives, and I went through the old newspapers trying to find a clipping of my trainer from the 1950s in Winnipeg. And what I found out over the course of that summer was that actually never happened. It was just part of wrestling lore. It didn't exist. But in the meantime, what I discovered was at Winnipeg in the 1950s, there was all of these great characters, guys that we knew later on in the West Coast, like Moose Morowski, Bulldog Bob Brown, the Von Steigers, Gil Hayes, Roy McClarty, George Gordienko, Ole Olson, Gordon Nelson, all of these guys that came out of Winnipeg. And it was fascinating for me, and I was hooked. So I started just by tracking the old cards and results, from the wrestling shows, and started with Winnipeg, and then how much more could there be in just Manitoba? So then we did all of the province of Manitoba, and then we got into the Stampede territory, and then it shouldn't be that much more to do the Vancouver territory, and then of course the East. So just the results collection alone is now over 6,000 pages of data, and I estimate about 82,000 wrestling shows from 1876 to the present. And I chip away at it every day. In fact, even earlier today, and that's why I was late on the call, is because I got into a hot vein of research through newspapers.com, because now a lot of these newspapers are digital. You don't have to go to the microfilm in the library. You can actually query and find the data you're looking for. So over the last couple of days, it's been Cornwall, Ontario, and Hamilton, Ontario, in the 1940s and 50s, filling in any gaps that I'm missing. But what I realized is, I thought, oh, I'm going to put this together, and then I'll be able to go and take this database of results and take it on a road trip with me with wrestlers and get them to fill in the blanks. So we knew they wrestled for this promoter. I've got a date I can't put any matches to. Let's see if they can do it. And what would happen inevitably is the guys would look at this and say, I have no idea, what match I wrestled 5 years ago in Port Alberni. So it started a secondary stream of research that now I was individually compiling careers, because now if you see your own career laid out, now maybe you can better identify versus just this directory of thousands and thousands of shows. You could identify, okay, in this month where you don't have any matches for me, that's when I was touring in Japan, or that's when I was injured. I had torn my knee and I wasn't wrestling at that time. So that's why there's a gap there. So over the last several years, and that started, in I would say the late 90s. With that, now I've researched the careers of more than 300 individual wrestlers, and it's been really cool, particularly with some of those legendary guys, that I get a chance to interact with through the Cauliflower Alley Club, where now I can give them a very comprehensive directory of their careers. And what's been really, really rewarding in that front is, when you go to somebody like Nick Bockwinkel or Mad Dog Vachon, who never kept a record themselves, and they would say, you know what, we were so busy living the life, we never bothered to write anything down. And now you have given us our whole life in a binder. This is a tremendous gift. So we've done a lot of that, and now we're using some of that material to share with organizations like the WWE and the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame to get wrestlers considered for Hall of Fame induction. that are also like long overdue for placement. So that's kind of the beginning of it. But then I realized, for the general consumer, even if they're interested in wrestling history, they don't want to buy a series of books that just have a listing of results. It's very niche. So we now need to take all of these results, all the 6,000 pages of data, and do something constructive with it to tell the story of Canadian wrestling in a very comprehensive and colorful way that's never been told before. And it ended up becoming my pandemic project when we couldn't do anything. Wrestling was canceled. Real life was canceled. You're supposed to stay home. There was no distractions because you can't even take your wife out to dinner. That wasn't allowed. So I had a full 18 months just to, assemble all this data and calculate stats and release the book. And that was in 2002. We published Uncontrolled Chaos, which is the first comprehensive encyclopedia of Canadian professional wrestling.
No, and congratulations on that. That was an incredible feat. You're one of the only people in COVID, I think, who went out to start a book and finished it. But
Yes. Yeah.
that'll almost be like super rewarding handing the records over.
Yeah, it's been a really cool rapport builder. You know, and I'd started researching for my own purposes, trying to fill in those gaps in the results database. But then, when I did my previous book, Wrestling in the Canadian West in 2009, yeah, 2009. One of the guys that I had a chance to interview for that book was the legendary Don Leo Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I was living in Langley, BC. And by the time I caught up with Don Leo, I discovered he only lived about 10 blocks from me. And so I went over to his house and we talked, old time wrestling for hours and hours and hours. And at the end, he said, come back anytime. I promise I won't stretch your neck. And even in his 70s, I'm pretty sure he still could. He was a very big man, a gentle giant, though. So as a thank you to Don Leo for taking all that time to sit with me and talk wrestling, I researched his record and also his father's record because he was second generation.
Oh, I
And the
didn't
next time
realize that.
yeah, and so the next time I went to visit Don Leo, I brought him this, and we spent that 2 hours just going through, and he was, seeing names that he had long forgotten about, and dates that he had long forgotten about, and so we forged a very good friendship. And every time I would come to Vancouver for matches, I'd always make time to go visit Don Leo in the afternoon. Sometimes he'd come down to the matches that night and watch the show. Even up to after he passed away, his family reached out to me and said, we know that you were a good friend of Dad's. We'd like you to come. We're now going to be moving out of the home, and we want to know if you'd like his stuff.
Wow.
Uh, and so I was able to go and inherit all of Don Leo's wrestling collection, including, the famous blue robe that he wore in Madison Square Garden against Pedro Morales, championship belts, trophies from Japan, his boots, his trunks.
That's
Uh,
incredible.
and then, like this incredible collection of about 5 banker's boxes of very detailed press clippings and magazines from his career. So I was able to, do even more digging into Don Leo and fill in some gaps that I had in his record. But now that record's sitting very close to 4,000 matches that he wrestled in his career.
Fantastic. Now, you said earlier the reason that you were late was you were investigating Hamilton, Ontario, which
Yeah,
is very coincidental because that was actually the site of the first Royal Rumble in 1988. So, can you give us an idea around that time, around Hamilton and the surrounding Ontario area, sort of what was happening there?
sure. Hamilton was a very important city for the Ontario wrestling scene all the way back to the 1930s. So when you look at, Frank Tunney and Maple Leaf Wrestling, of course, Frank was WWF President Jack Tunney's uncle. Uh, he was, one of the original, promoters of Toronto. He was like an office boy in the Toronto office under the original promoter for the Queensbury Athletic Club, which we've more commonly known as Maple Leaf Wrestling over the years. And then when Jack Corcoran died, Frank Tunney and his brother John took over the company, in the late 30s, and they promoted Ontario right up till the 1984 when finally they sold out to the WWF. With the Tunneys negotiating a deal where now they had, a position within the organization, and now, Jack Tunney, of course, was the figurehead president of the WWF. So Hamilton was a weekly stop for decades. They had Toronto, Niagara Falls, Hamilton, Oshawa, Kitchener, London. But it was, Hamilton was a mainstay. They would do like 50, 51 dates a year in Hamilton. And then, as the Maple Leaf territory started to die off, in the later part of the 70s, when the Crockett's were partnered with the Tunneys in the late 70s and early 80s, Hamilton became the TV taping spot for them to get their Canadian content to broadcast in Canada. So they would go do tapings in Hamilton, for to satisfy their CRTC requirements for Canadian content. So Hamilton being the first site, being a site of a TV taping for the WWF in 1988, and ultimately being the location that incidentally was the first Royal Rumble location. Even to this day, Hamilton is still heavily regarded as a wrestling town.
Excellent. I'm curious, in all of your research and travels, since we're being very Canadian today, is there an incident or a story that happened that you'd say is something that could only happen in Canada?
I think that, when we look at stuff, it might not necessarily be something that happened in the ring, but there's certainly adventures and misadventures, that we've had in Canadian wrestling that's pretty unique to us. And I would say, the Ice Road tours in Canada, and, the multiple tours. Of course, the Tony Condello one in Manitoba is the most well-known.
Very infamous. Yeah.
Yeah, and has probably the most famous alumni that have come out of that tour, right? Where you've got guys like Lance Storm and Edge, Christian, Rhino, Joe Legend, all of these guys. Even Scott Norton has done, a Condello Ice Road tour. But, they still continue to this day. So Condello still has his annual campaign in Manitoba. But there's, promoters in Ontario that are doing those, remote northern communities in Quebec and Ontario. Can-Am Wrestling out of Calgary was then doing ice roads in the Northwest Territories. So, because of the climate, it's something that we can do that not many other parts of the world would ever see.
Excellent. Before I let you go, I'll just pose one last question to you. Who would you say is the best Canadian wrestler?
What I have to look very heavily at a statement that was made by Lou Thez, and he actually put this in his book, in his autobiography, Hooker, where he identified Winnipeg's George Gordienko as the greatest Canadian wrestler of all time. And I'll qualify that in a few ways. So Lou Thez actually was so fond of George that in 1956, he wanted to drop the NWA World Championship to George Gordienko. Now, George, at that time, in the late 1940s, having the name Gordienko at a time when the American government was actively looking for communists during the Cold War, Gordienko had actually been deported 7 years earlier from the U.S. for suspicion of being a communist. And so when Thez had proposed this, now the NWA had to approach the Department of Defense in the U.S. to see if they could get this ban lifted for Gordienko. And they wouldn't relent. They said, no, this guy, we think he's a communist and we don't want to let him in the country. So as a result of that, Whipper Billy Watson got his second NWA world title run instead. But Gordienko went to Europe and became a major star. And he really became an international kingmaker. So what would happen with, you might be aware of this from Japan in the 1980s. If you were a young boy coming up in Japan and you wanted to be a main eventer, you had to leave the country for a year and go make your name somewhere else and then come back to Japan. So you saw guys like Hirohase come to Calgary and wrestled for a year with Stampede Wrestling. You saw a Great Muta come to the U.S. and he wrestled in Florida and Texas and Puerto Rico and, ultimately the NWA, where he became a huge sensation, then went back to Japan and became a huge star. But before that, the North America was really seen as the place, a lot of the wrestlers from all around the world, whether it was from Australia or India or whatever, they would go to England, to the UK, to test their skills against some of these like real world-class shooters. And Gordienko, that's where he was based. So they would go over to England and work with Gordienko. When it was time for them to go back to their home country and they needed a guy to come in as basically the heel champion to build the local babyface, Gordienko would be the guy. So Gordienko went to New Zealand and established John Da Silva. Then he went to India and established the guy over there. And then he went to Greece and established the guy over there. So when you look at the history, Gordienko was this kingmaker internationally. But we'll look at, also his power to draw. So Gordienko in 1971 went to Iraq to do the same honors for Adnan Al-Kaisi. And at the time, Al-Kaisi was very over with the reigning government. So you'll be familiar with the name Saddam Hussein, right?
It's come up.
Al-Kaisi was very over with him. So they booked in Gordienko to come in and put over Al-Kaisi. In 1971, Gordienko was paid $10,000 to come for one match in Baghdad, Iraq, against Adnan Al-Kaisi. They drew 215,000 people. And this isn't like WrestleMania. They drew 215,000 for a 10-match show. They drew 215,000 people for one match, Gordienko versus Al-Kaisi. And so when we look at it, and everything that people say about him, like he was in that same league with Billy Robinson and Bert Asarati in the UK, right? He could run with Luther Lindsay and Lou Thesz in the US. Very highly respected, right up to his death, and, traveled the world, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, India, Greece, UK, all over. So he's a name that's kind of been sorely overlooked by the history books. So, but hands down, Gordienko, number one of all time.
Excellent. Fantastic. So we do have to wrap things up here, but very quickly, if you could let the people at home know where can they find you, where they can find your book.
Yeah, so I'm still not completely off the road. I've been removed from a role in ring to a role managing my stable, Los Intocables, in primetime wrestling in northern British Columbia. I'll be back there in a few weeks, and I'm there about 4 or 5 times a year. So I'm very active on usually Facebook, not as much on Instagram, but you can find me at Vance Nevada, Canadian Professional Wrestler on Facebook. And the book, Uncontrolled Chaos, is published by Friesen Press, a great Canadian company, and it's available in their bookstore at friesenpress.com.
Vance, thank you so much for joining us today. That was a lot of great information, and all the best.
Absolutely. I look forward to talking to you anytime.
Another big thank you to our special guest, Vance Nevada. Make sure you check out his book, Uncontrolled Chaos. It is a great read. We'll have a link in the show notes as well as on our social media so you can get yourself a copy. Before we call it a day, let me pose the same question to all of you. Who is your favorite wrestler to come out of Canada? Reach out, let us know. Thank you for listening to this episode of Rumble Retrospective. Once again, this has been Greg, aka the 78th Doctor. We'll see you next week for our first mini-sode, and then in 2 weeks when we look at Royal Rumble 1989. And don't forget, never let both feet touch the floor. If you have any questions, comments, memories, or constructive corrections, you can find us on social media at The Rumble Retro. Join our official Discord or email me directly at the78thdoctor@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Please don't forget to rate and review the show. We truly appreciate it. Want to support the show? Join our Patreon and unlock some additional bonus content. Intro and outro themes composed by Jamie McDonald. You can find more by searching Chatterless on your favorite platform. He makes music, all kinds. Logo and cover art design provided by Michael J. Cohen at Arkangel Wulf Design and Illustration. Check him out at arkangelwulf.com. Check the episode notes for all of our links. This show is dedicated to Dad and Owen.